Hey folks, Iron Docks is one of the dungeons returning in Shadowlands Season 4, so I decided to put together this short guide which will teach you all of the important mechanics that you need to know about. This is the first time Iron Docks has ever been in the Mythic Plus pool, as the system wasn't present during the Warlords of Draenor expansion. The strategy I'll be discussing in this video is an updated version of the one I used for challenge modes, but it's entirely possible that something better will be discovered later in the season. If that does happen, it's likely that I'll mention it in a pinned comment in the video description, but for now, let's get into the strategy for Iron Docks. The first area of Iron Docks is very open and contains multiple different packs of orcs. Even though you could just cut a path to the first boss relatively quickly, I'd recommend pulling nearly everything in this room, as it's fairly efficient for reaching kill percent. The four main types of mobs that you'll encounter in this area are foot soldiers, deadeyes, incinerators, and technicians. The foot soldiers will cast Demoralizing Roar, which reduces the damage you deal by 15%. This cast is interruptible, so you should make sure to kick it whenever possible. The foot soldiers will also charge to random players and apply an AoE bleed, so your group should maintain a loose spread whenever you fight these guys. The deadeyes and incinerators will target random players and fire their guns at them. The shots from these deadeyes will slow affected players, while the shots from the incinerators will also apply a stacking fire dot that your healer should dispel. The incinerators will also fire an AoE cone called Shrapnel Blast in the direction of the tank, so they should be faced away from the group. Finally, the technicians are a bit weird, as they'll only cast one of two possible abilities. If you want to figure out which ability they're able to cast, you can find it displayed as a buff on their nameplate. Grease Vial will target a random player and cause a pool of grease to spawn below them. Attempting to use spells or abilities while standing in the grease puddle will cause you to slip and fall, so just move out of it if this targets you. High Explosive Grenade will target a random player and deal AoE damage to anyone standing nearby. In case you haven't noticed already, every single one of these abilities will punish your group for stacking up, so once again, it's incredibly important that you maintain a loose spread. Throughout this section of Iron Docks, you'll also come across a few special enemies that effectively serve as mini-bosses. The Unruly Ogren in the far corner will cast two abilities. Thundering Stomp deals massive unavoidable damage to your entire group, and Flurry is a series of attacks on your tank which deals an absurdly high amount of damage. The Gromcar Battlemaster can be found patrolling back and forth across the first room, and he has a passive buff which makes him immune to all stun effects. Additionally, he has two different abilities, the first of which is Chain Drag. This will target a random player, deal damage to them, and pull them towards the Battlemaster. If you get hit by this, make sure to run away and then return to your previous position. This is largely because the Battlemaster will usually follow up his chain grabs with a Blade Storm that deals heavy damage to anyone it hits. Since it's impossible to stun the Battlemaster, melee DPS will just need to run away until it finishes casting. Both the Unruly Ogren and this Battlemaster are fairly annoying and inefficient, so my personal recommendation would be to just avoid pulling them. You may notice that within this first section, there's actually a second Battlemaster, but on keys that are plus 10 or higher, it's replaced by the mini-boss Dreadlord Zul'Gurmux. This is easily the most difficult location for Zul'Gurmux in any of the 8 dungeons, as she's accompanied by a technician, a foot soldier, and an incinerator, all of which are fairly nasty in their own right. It's completely reasonable to just skip this pack, as Zul'Gurmux can be fairly annoying to deal with on higher keys. If you're curious to learn more about Zul'Gurmux or the Shrouded affix in general, I'd recommend checking out the short guide I made for it, which you can find linked in the description below. We haven't even reached the first boss, and yet we still have 3 more mini-bosses to discuss. Champion Druna can be found accompanied by a foot soldier and an incinerator, and I would highly recommend only pulling her with these 2 mobs, as she'll grant a 15% damage buff to nearby enemies. She'll also cast 2 different arrow barrages, the first of which is the Barbed Arrow Barrage, which deals unavoidable AoE damage to your entire group. The other version of this ability is Burning Arrows, which causes flame patches to appear, and standing inside of them will cause you to take heavy ticking damage. Siegemaster Olgar will patrol in an L shape around the area, and he has 2 different abilities. Shattering Strike will deal AoE damage in an area around Olgar, and Throw Gatecrasher will cause Olgar to toss his weapon towards a random player. The weapon will then spin around, dealing AoE damage to anyone standing inside of it. Basically, it functions like the Ravager talent for warriors. The final mini-boss is Pitward and Gwarnock, and he can be found alongside 1 Deadeye, 1 Technician, and 1 Foot Soldier. It's worth noting that the boss will patrol very close to Gwarnock's pack, so you should be careful in order to ensure that you don't accidentally pull him in. Pitward and Gwarnock is a glorified Battlemaster, as he also casts the aforementioned Blade Storm and Chain Drag abilities. That said, he does have one unique cast called Brutal Inspiration, and this will give nearby enemies 50% increased attack speed and 15% increased damage. This ability can't be interrupted, stunned, or removed, so you're just going to have to out-heal the increased damage. Finally, we've reached the first boss, Fleshrunner Nakar, and despite the nerfs he received during the PTR, he's still a fairly challenging fight. At the start, Nakar will be mounted on his wolf, Dreadfang, and after the wolf reaches 50% HP, Nakar will dismount. Immediately upon being dismounted by Nakar, Dreadfang will charge in a random direction and absolutely dumpster anyone he hits. This wolf will also cast Savage Mauling, causing him to chase down a random player and deal heavy damage to them over time. Oh, and he'll also cast Bloodletting Howl, causing him and Nakar to deal 10% increased damage. In case it wasn't obvious, this wolf absolutely fucks, so your primary goal should be to kill him as soon as possible. I would personally recommend holding your cooldowns and your bloodlust until you get Nakar to dismount. Shortly before you reach 50% health, all of your melee DPS should run out to Africa in order to avoid the shredding swipes. Once that cast finishes, pop Lust, blow all of your cooldowns, and erase Dreadfang from this plane of existence. Even after the wolf is dead, you're not out of the woods yet, as Nakar comes with a fairly nasty set of abilities himself. Two of them, Barbed Arrow Barrage and Burning Arrows, are identical to the abilities cast by Champion Druna, one of the mini-bosses we discussed earlier. The tank will need to kite Nakar around the room in order to help the group avoid the nasty flame patches. Nakar's final ability is Reckless Provocation, and this thing is extremely annoying. The cast time of this ability is really fast, and after it goes off, any damage you deal to Nakar will cause you to be feared for 2 seconds. This effect even triggers from auto attacks or constant effects like Rushing Jade Wind, so you'll actually need to click your portrait in order to force your character to stop attacking the boss. The dumbest part about this ability is that it almost always overlaps with the fire arrows, so making a mistake and fearing yourself can potentially cause you to get comboed and die. Thankfully, this ability is now dispellable, and I would go so far as to say that having someone in your group who can do this is basically mandatory if you're attempting to push this key. Although you'll normally head up the nearby ramp and just continue along with the dungeon, I do think it's worth pointing out that there's a large area behind Fleshrunner Nakar that contains a mix of the mobs we discussed earlier, but with one new addition. The Gromcar deckhands have one ability, which, Contain Your Disbelief, is an AoE targeted at a random player. Many people will just opt to skip these mobs, but I actually find that pulling a small pack with one of these dreadlords is fairly efficient. Returning to the normal path of the dungeon, you'll encounter 3 Ogren Laborers, which cast Flurry and Thundering Stomp, just like the unruly Ogren from earlier. The safe way to handle these mobs would be to pull them one at a time, but that being said, my recommendation is to have your tank drag them under the first Iron Star. At this point, someone can launch it to one-shot all 3 of the Ogren, along with some of the mobs standing in the back. With the second Iron Star, your 2 main targets will be the Ogren beating up a pile of metal and the patrol of orcs and an Ogren in the far back. The third Iron Star is where things get interesting. Back in the old challenge mode days, the popular strategy was to pull all of the remaining mobs up to the second boss and use the final Iron Star to one-shot all of them. Although I personally found this to be a fun part of the original design of the dungeon, Blizzard evidently disagreed, as there is now a 15 mob target cap for all of the Iron Stars. That being said, assuming you were efficient with your previous 2 Iron Stars, there should only be around 15 mobs remaining in this area. Your tank should round all of them up, at which point the final Iron Star can be used to one-shot them. Unfortunately, the Nathrezim infiltrators cannot be damaged by Iron Stars, so you'll just have to kill them manually. After clearing out the Iron Star area, you'll encounter a pack with 2 deckhands, a Gromcar Chainmaster, and an Ogren Laborer. The Chainmaster, which is an enemy we have yet to encounter, will cast 2 abilities. Iron Warcry will buff the attack speed of nearby enemies by 25%, and Whirling Chains will summon some small metal Beyblades which bounce around the room. Standing in one of these Beyblades will deal damage, so you should kite the mobs back in order to avoid getting hit. Be careful before entering the next section of the dungeon, as it's what I like to call the Bomb Gauntlet. Periodically, Skullok will blanket one half of the gauntlet with a cannon barrage, and after this barrage finishes, he'll do the same to the other half of the gauntlet. This barrage is extremely lethal, to put it lightly, so it's important that you take cover behind the nearby terrain. Thankfully, the boxes in this area are set up in a way that you'll always have some room to take cover in. It's worth noting that Skullok's barrage will damage enemy mobs in addition to players, so the tank should try to keep the mobs just out in the open while the group hides behind cover. Within this gauntlet, you'll have to fight 2 groups of mobs and 1 Ogren Laborer. All of the mob packs here are just mix-ups of the enemies we've already encountered, so you'll just want to handle them in the exact same way that I discussed earlier. After you reach the end of the Gauntlet, Skulllock will stop firing and the second boss encounter will appear. This boss is a council fight against 3 mobs named Ariok, Macog, and Nissa. These enemies do not share a health pool and they can be killed separately. I recommend following a kill order of Ariok, then Macog, and finally Nissa. Ariok will cast Blood Bolt, which deals damage to a random player and should be interrupted, purely because there's nothing else to interrupt in this fight. She'll also cast Tainted Blood, which applies a dot to a random player, but her really annoying ability is Sanguine Sphere. This will apply an Absorb Shield to the boss at the lowest health, and the shield will fade away after a few seconds. That being said, if it breaks, it'll heal all bosses for 15% of their maximum health. This shield is the primary reason why Ariok is on top of the kill priority list, so you should make sure to Lust on Pull and burn her down as quickly as possible. When she applies the shield to herself, your DPS should swap to Nissa for a short period of time. The reason I recommend swapping to Nissa instead of Macog is because currently the shield is extremely small, and DPSing Macog can be a bit risky. If you do this, you might accidentally cleave down Ariok and break her shield, causing all of the bosses to be healed. Once the shield fades though, your DPS can safely swap back to Ariok. Macog is next on the kill priority, and this is purely because of his 2 abilities, Flaming Slash and Lava Sweep. These are both somewhat difficult to avoid, and they'll deal fairly heavy damage if they hit you. Functionally, both of these abilities are identical, as they're rectangular-shaped AoEs that Macog will fire at a random player. The only difference is that Flaming Slash will cause Macog to physically move around the room, whereas Lava Sweep will persist for a longer period of time, but won't cause Macog to move at all. When he begins casting these abilities, melee DPS should just take a moment to dodge the attack before they continue doing damage. Finally, Nissa Nox will shoot random players and cast a Chain Lightning effect which hits 3 people in your group. She'll also throw a ring of traps around a random player, and if you step into one of them, you'll be stunned and take a hefty chunk of damage. Thankfully, it's fairly easy to just move through the gaps and avoid getting hit by any of the traps. The only really notable thing that Nissa does is summoning an ad called a Bomb Squad. This mob will run towards a random player and explode after it reaches them, dealing AoE damage to anyone hit. This sounds pretty scary until you realize the cast time of the Bomb Squad's detonation is fairly long. This means that the targeted players can just trigger the detonation and walk away before it goes off, which means they take absolutely no damage. Yeah, Nissa is pretty easy to manage, and that's why she's at the bottom of the kill priority. Following the second boss, you'll have to clear out a long corridor filled with beasts and Thunderlord Wranglers. The enemies in this area are extremely annoying, and my personal strategy involves using a rogue Shroud of Concealment to skip all of them. That being said, I will go ahead and explain what each mob here does, just in case you decide to pull it in your run. The most common enemy you'll find is the Thunderlord Wrangler, and if you're familiar with Shadowlands dungeons, you'll recognize these guys as the Javelin enemies from Spires of Ascension. That being said, these Wranglers are way more annoying and way more deadly. Your first instinct upon fighting them might be to hide in a corner and abuse line of sight, just like you did with the Forsworn mobs back in Spires. Unfortunately, the Wranglers will also cast a Frontal Cone AoE, making this strategy extremely difficult. To make matters worse, they'll also throw patches of Caltrops onto the ground, which deal ticking damage to anyone standing inside of them. In case it isn't obvious, this is an extremely deadly combination of abilities, and this is only exacerbated by the fact that the Wrangler packs always come with a Rampaging Clefthoof or an Ironwing Flamespitter attached. First, let's talk about the Rampaging Clefthoof. This mob will apply bleeds in the tank with its auto attacks, which on its own isn't very deadly. However, it'll also cast Trampling Stampede, causing it to charge at a random player and deal AoE damage to anyone nearby. Overall, this is just a beefy mob that hits the tank pretty hard, but when you view it in the context of a pull with the Wranglers, the Stampede ability will just make it even harder to properly LOS them. The Ironwing Flamespitters will lob balls of fire around the room, and these will deal heavy damage to anyone hit. These balls of fire will also leave a patch on the ground that will deal heavy ticking damage if you're standing inside of it. Once you've reached the end of this long corridor, you'll come across one final pack of trash which contains a Dreadlord, a Battlemaster, and another mini-boss named Siegemaster Rokra. This mini-boss will cast the exact same abilities as Siegemaster Oligar from earlier. In case you forgot, Shattering Strike will deal AoE damage to nearby players, and Throw Gatecrasher will spawn a weapon nearby that deals AoE damage to anyone standing inside of it. While these mobs aren't too difficult to manage, they're still relatively inefficient, so I'd recommend skipping them as well. That being said, it is possible to CC the Dreadlord and pull him separately from the other two mobs. In the following room, you'll find the third boss, Oshir, which is a pretty straightforward fight with only 3 abilities. At the start of the encounter, your tank should pull Oshir to the corner near the big boat and face him towards the wall. His first main ability is Feeding Frenzy, which causes him to jump on top of a random player and deal heavy damage to them for 20 seconds. In order to stop this cast, you'll need to deal 8% of Oshir's health and damage, at which point he'll go back to attacking the tank. Oshir's other main ability is Primal Assault, which causes him to charge in a random direction and deal massive damage to anyone standing in front of him. After you've figured out which direction Oshir is charging towards, your group should move out of the way to avoid taking damage. This is one of the reasons why you'll want to pull Oshir into the corner, as your group can bait him into charging directly into a wall, allowing your melee DPS to maintain higher uptime. The other reason for tanking him here is because of his final mechanic, Breakout. This will cause Oshir to leap to a random cage and release the animals contained within. There are 2 different types of animal cages, a wolf cage and a Rylak cage. The wolves will ignore threat and auto-attack random players, so your DPS should set up an AoE stun rotation and nuke them down as quickly as possible. The Rylak is extremely annoying to deal with, as it cannot be tanked or moved and will simply hover in place and bombard the group with poison spit. You could try to kill this mob, and if you do, you'll need to make sure to interrupt every single spit that it casts. That being said, I would personally recommend using crowd control effects on this Rylak and then just ignoring it for the rest of the encounter. From here, it's a race to finish off Oshir before the beasts overwhelm you. Immediately after taking down Oshir, you'll be able to board the nearby ship and start the final boss encounter against Skollak, Korrimar, and Zogosh. It's worth noting that there's a Dreadlord hiding in the back end of the ship, so it could be worth pulling him in to finish off your kill percent. The boss fight has 2 phases. At the start, Skollak will simply auto-attack your tank, and Zogosh will be sitting inside of a cannon. While inside of his cannon, Zogosh cannot be attacked. He'll just repeatedly cast rapid fire on a random player, dealing heavy damage to them and anyone standing between them and the cannon. You've heard it many times already, so it should come as no surprise, but you'll want to maintain a loose spread to avoid getting blasted by this damage. The primary threat at the start of the fight is Korrimar, as he'll cast the Leap, which deals AoE damage to nearby players when he lands. He also shoots out an effect that travels along the ground, and at the time of my recording this, the ability has an awful visual effect that makes it nearly impossible to spot. Because of this, you'll want to pop Lust and burn Korrimar down as quickly as possible. Once he's dead, Zogosh will pop out of the machine turret and auto-attack the tank, meaning he really isn't much of a threat. After 30 seconds have passed during Phase 1, Skollak will cast Ground Smash, stunning all players, dealing medium damage to them, and knocking them to the back of the ship. He'll then immediately begin casting Cannon Barrage, which functions exactly like it did during the Bomb Gauntlet area from earlier. You can take cover behind the nearby boxes, but you'll ideally want to have someone in your group who can reach Skollak before he starts casting his second Cannon Barrage. Having a mobile class like a Demon Hunter, a Monk, or a Rogue will really help here, as they'll always be able to make it back to Skollak with enough time to stop his cast. After it's been interrupted, the fight will simply repeat until you manage to kill both Skollak and Zogosh. And with that, we've covered everything you need to know in order to clear Mythic Plus Iron Docks in Season 4 of Shadowlands. If you want to learn more about the other dungeons returning in Season 4, I'd recommend checking out my Dungeon Guide playlist, which you can find linked in the description below.